The seaweed is always cleaning all the excess nutrients. You dream about floating seasteads and econ incentives. Just look at the land around you. Grow GMO monocrop. Outside countries easy claim an ANCAP utopia. Out on the sea, it's seasteading. OTEC and algae, low trophic farming and Campeche. Out on the land they fight all day. Here it's a free society. Tsunami resistant, modular living, it's seasteading. Good morning, everyone. This is the second episode of the Kerry&Liam podcast. I'll be your host, Liam. Today, we will be reviewing an interesting book that my friend recommended me. When he first recommended it to me, I was broadly familiar with the concept, but very confused going in as to what it was actually about. The book is called Seasteading by a Mr. Joe Quirk with Patry Friedman. Now, seasteading broadly as a concept is kind of what it says on the tin, the idea of living at sea on artificial cities. The concept is broadly tied in with various libertarian and anarcho-capitalist circles, who are some of the biggest proponents of the idea, but it is not inherently related to that as the book itself says. It is merely a means of providing a variety of advantages to the earth, to humans, to political stability, while creating more space and more opportunity for humans, which sounds like a great thing. So kind of get right into it here. I'm going to have to flip through the book because I read it about a month ago and I kind of forget some of the parts of it. But it was a very interesting read. I was very pleasantly surprised upon reading it because I really was not very sure about how it was going to be when I first got into it. Going into the book, it sounds like it could be quite a utopian fantasy land of things that are probably never likely to happen. What I really like about the book, though, is that it is actually a bottom-up solution, and it follows 6 aquapreneurs, as you call it, entrepreneurs that have various ideas about seasteading that are trying to find ways to make money out at sea. And the contention of the book is that when there is money out at sea, then we will move out to sea naturally. And it doesn't have to be enforced at the point of a gun by any government or funded by any government project. It will simply be the free choice of human beings to go start a new life, similar to what happened in the New World and various other opportunities that came up during the prior millennium. But the book also calls to light a few issues of resources that might come up for humans in 2050. And I'm not very familiar with these, as to how true they are. I'm sure there's definitely some big truth in what they're talking about, but it's talking about water scarcity for large amounts of the human population, food. That is a big issue as well. And we talked a little bit about this in the previous podcast about farmland being depleted, and actually water and food are very tied together, because the depletion of topsoils and kind of desertification of soils and acidification, although it doesn't really change the rainfall over land, it changes the amount of water that the land will suck up, which is fresh water, and will be stored in underwater aquifers, and then that instead just re-evaporates or drains off into the ocean. So it leads to less fresh water for people. Peak oil and stuff like that. They had some very interesting stuff in the book about that. Fish. Now, fish is kind of an oddball one because we don't need to eat fish, but I understand that a lot of people like to eat fish, and he has some interesting ideas about that. Fertilizer. Well, that's exactly the same thing with food, is that our topsoil is depleted, isn't it? And land. And of course, most of the earth is water. There's not very much land, all things considered. That's another interesting thing about the book, is that when you think about it, it kind of seems like a duh moment that as humans, we evolved on the land, obviously. And despite this, the land only makes up a small portion of the Earth's surface area. So it kind of begs the question of why haven't we really, in a greater sense, settled the sea, which is the majority of the Earth. I wasn't expecting this from such a big selling book, but right underneath the surface, boiling underneath, is a very libertarian message about creating our own world and freedom from government and stuff, which I really enjoyed, but I wasn't quite expecting that. But like I say, it doesn't necessarily have to be read that way. You could create a big government seastead if you wanted to. I don't know how successful it would be, but that is a possibility. It isn't strictly about that, because the point is to create different seasteads that can their own system of work. And so you don't necessarily need to be tied to your place of birth or these big states or totalitarian government. You can simply move to a different seastead or even unlink your domicile from the seastead you're on and float to a different one. All of this stuff might sound very utopian and unrealistic to have all these floating cities housing huge populations of people and saving the planet. But the book very cleverly goes through the fact that there's many cases of this type of stuff already happening right now. They're just not very widely implemented. But one example he comes up with is the nation of the Netherlands, where my sister's husband is from, and I visited it. It is a very beautiful country, and one of the most unique countries in the world by far, I would say. Country is, as many people know, largely under sea level, which creates a variety of engineering problems for the country. Namely, one is that groundwater levels underneath the soil are extremely high, which makes the soil, in many cases, not very stable. As well, they've actually, I might be wrong, but I think they about doubled the size of the Netherlands within the last 500 years, and they were doing this quite a long time ago. They've been reclaiming land from the sea to a great extent. And actually, if you go to the Netherlands, there's a highway that you can drive along that is in the north of the Netherlands to the south, to Holland, I believe. And when you drive along it, you're actually driving with ocean visible to both sides of you. This giant highway is a seawall that separates the Atlantic Ocean, but it might technically be the North Sea, I think, from the actual main landmass of the Netherlands. And there is like an interior sea there that the water level is regulated to keep it more reasonable and protect against waves and that sort of thing. But it's a very interesting country, and they have that Middle Ages European thing where they have canals everywhere before heavy roads were as common. So they actually have these large canal boats that could carry things around in the Middle Ages. It is very cool, and an example of people working with the sea, where they don't have just plentiful land available or all that stuff. So they have to work with the sea. They have to create artificial land, and it actually works for them. As well, the book mentions that many people in the Netherlands in certain flood-prone areas, they actually have their houses able to float riding along a steel pole. So, the Netherlands probably will flood again at some point. It's only a matter of time until one of their dikes breaks. And so people prepare for it. They know that this is going to happen and that they just need to be ready for it. And it's not really that big of a deal. You just need to be aware of it. It will happen. And that's something that could really benefit a lot of other areas in the world that have similar high water tables, but really don't plan for it. Like, for example, some areas in the south of the US, like Florida and stuff, when they have a hurricane, every time it just destroys an immense amount of properties, because they kind of build like everywhere else in America that might have a solid soil beneath them. But when the water table rises and storms come and stuff like that, just everything floods away. And there are some other interesting examples. Southeast Asia is a very cool one. As you guys know, Kerry is from southern China, and they don't have this as much anymore, but you can still see little glimpses of it. A lot of South Asia is people living around these along rivers and water valleys and stuff. This includes Vietnam and South China, I would say, and probably Laos and Cambodia as well. I'm not so familiar. But in these places, as of a couple hundred years ago, there were huge populations of boat people. And these people, I'm not super familiar with it once again, and the book goes into more detail about it, but these sea peoples, sometimes they maybe lacked legal status in their canton or province or whatever, or they were considered kind of like a lower caste or something like that. And so they lived on boats, never crossing to the land. And there were these boats tied up all along the shorelines of these places like Canton and the Mekong Valley and stuff. And people traded that way. And the very cool thing about doing that is that water is our natural roads on the planet, especially rivers and such. If you are living on the river in your little houseboat, you can unmoor it and go transport things around for money or sell things in different areas. So you pick up rice in one area and you bring it to the city and sell it. So you have your work and your home all in one place, and you're able to travel around where you need. Now, these type of houseboats, I would assume that most of them couldn't go on the open ocean, but why do you really need that? In most of these river valleys, there would be millions and millions of people, even 100 years ago, living all along them. So they would have a large population and lots of things available for industry and economy. And it's very cool. And one of the interesting things as well about that is that you can see that type of a free society where people can move around and economically trade largely how they please because they're not sanctioned by the government. They kind of have to do things under the table. What ended up happening in Canton specifically is that the British got the Hong Kong island, and then later the little sections of the mainland called the New Territories from the Qing dynasty. And what ended up happening is that these boat people that were frowned upon by mainstream Chinese society and stuff, I believe they got a little bit more status and freedom in the new Hong Kong territory, and so they ended up being traders and having that mentality of like leaving behind the old world caste systems and stuff. They ended up very readily taking to the British system of free market capitalism and stuff. And so it ended up making Hong Kong a very wealthy territory and an important part of the British Empire at certain times. Another interesting example, and this one is much more modern, is cruise ships, because when he's talking about the scale of these cities, it sounds kind of crazy with the amount of people and producing their own fresh water and producing their own energy and all this stuff and being able to move around. Sounds crazy, but he actually breaks it down that cruise ships are already doing this when you actually look at the numbers. And when you consider all of the cruise ships in the world, it's a pretty enormous amount of people at sea all the time, and an enormous land area actually, all calculated together with all the floors of the cruise ships all together. This is a lot of humans living at sea at one time, and it's a big industry. And it does give pause to the thinking that this is actually not that crazy. This could be done. Similarly, oil rigs at sea are another great example of that. They're independent floating cities that have to provide their own energy, their own economy as well. There has to be a financial incentive for them to be out there. They have to support all their people. They have hospitals. They are usually anchored, but they are able to move around using their own propulsion. And once again, when you add up all of the oil rigs, all of the people on them, these are some enormous numbers that are comparable to a city in some cases. Not only that, but in the case of oil rigs more than cruise ships, their underwater area ends up being a host for sea life. Sea life generally, for the most part, only lives close to the surface of the ocean where there's sunlight so that they can photosynthesize, and then little fish can eat those photosynthesized plants and such. So most of the ocean, of course, is very deep, and there's not much to hold on to at the surface to photosynthesize. So these type of things, oil rigs, not really cruise ships because they don't want sea life building up on them. They provide a place for sea life to begin photosynthesizing and doing all this very beneficial stuff. One of my favorite stories from the book is about a gentleman named Ricardo Radulich, who is a PhD who works in Costa Rica. What I really like about what he's saying is that he's trying to come up with an economic motive and a reason for people to live at sea, but he's also not doing it from the top down. He's doing it from the bottom up and suggesting that this is something that the third world and the second world can and should do, and will provide with money and with food, and something that can be easily employed. And what he is trying to do farming at sea. This is the same thing. We have a small to the earth is actual land. Very little of it is usable farmland increasingly. And instead, we haven't looked at the sea. And the sea has some unique advantages for farming. On land, we always have typically, especially if you're farming in a plant's native environment, you have pests and diseases and fungi that end up reducing yield, requiring more chemicals, all these sorts of things. So what he tried doing was he tried making a float platform on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. You have plenty of sun, you have no pests, and no natural pathogens or anything that will damage the plants. But the big issue was, where does the water come from? Because you need fresh water for land crops. They evolved to use fresh water. And so he tried making little equipment to make fresh water using sunlight and stuff like that. But that is a very challenging process, and usually doesn't yield enough water. So he came to the epiphany, the book says, that why don't we use the plants that evolved to actually use salt water rather than trying to force these land plants to make fresh water. And that is a very, very clever idea, because actually the sea has enormous biodiversity of plants. They're mostly kelp and that sort of thing, but there is a lot of biodiversity among kelp and a lot of different uses for it. The book notes here that in 1630, Flemish physician John Baptiste van Helmont planted a 5-pound willow branch in 200 pounds of soil. 5 years later, he had a willow tree weighing 165 pounds, yet the soil had only lost 2 ounces. Where did the 164 pounds and 14 ounces of tree come from? Now we know the answer: water and carbon atoms in the air, 2 things of which the ocean has plenty. And this is something that kelp and algae take advantage of, is that there is carbon in the air and water specifically in this case. And there's sunlight, and so they end up taking that and aggregating that into their body, which we can then use for other things. Food is the product of recent photosynthesis, says Ricardo, and fossil fuels are the product of ancient photosynthesis. We depend on photosynthesis, yet nobody knows how to do it. Nobody has invented a machine that can take CO2 from the air and, with added water and energy, churn out sugar, not with any amount of energy. Human knowledge of photosynthesis has not yet reached the intelligence of kelp, a brown seaweed chock full of nutrients which performs this trick effortlessly. By creating little seaweed farms, we can solve a variety of problems that the oceans specifically have. There is carbon pollution in the ocean, which reduces planting seaweed will reduce the acidity, pull CO2 out of the ocean. There's dead zones as well. I think a lot of people have heard of this, where in major river systems that go out to the ocean, there's a lot of artificial fertilizer being put into the soil, and once again, the soil is dying, so the fertilizer just washes away with rain, and it ends up polluting these watersheds, which are typically some of the prime real estate in the ocean that is a little bit closer up to the surface, so a lot of fish and plants used to live there. But with this huge nitrogen and phosphorus dumping out into the ocean, it kind of tends to grow a lot of small microorganisms that blot out all the sun, and so it's killing some of the prime real estate in the ocean that really does a lot of work for us. Planting kelp can feed the world. It is a food that we can use for either ourselves or for livestock, if people decide, or for fish. It is also potentially a source of energy. I believe there is research, I'm not sure how far into it is, but to produce petroleum-like fuels out of seaweed. I think there is a way to do that. And to end poverty in coastal nations as well, to get people in the third world with not much equipment able to begin making money growing this stuff. And to get healthy as well. There's a lot of very helpful things in seaweed. He lists some of it here. There's omega-3 fatty acids, which are in fish as well, and that's a big reason why people say to eat fish. But where do the fish get it? They actually get it from kelp as well. There's another thing specifically from the vegan perspective that they mentioned here, because of course my wife and I and our son are vegan, and one of the nutrients that you cannot get in any natural land source is vitamin B12, and it is a necessary metabolic vitamin. So it is recommended to supplement it. It is necessary for life for vegans, and even non-vegans. Most non-vegans don't get enough B12. And it doesn't come from animals then, as people might conclude. It actually comes from bacteria. Bacteria are what make B12. And because we chlorinate all of our water and have a very sanitary environment, we do not have enough bacteria producing B12 to satiate our needs. But apparently certain kelp have a lot of B12, so that would be a great way to supplement it in your diet. And as a matter of fact, that's how vegan B12 supplements get it. They get it from processing kelp. Wheat, corn, and soybeans are only types of land plants. Algae is the entire category of plants that grow in water, and varieties are almost endless. Approximately 10,500 species of seaweed have been counted. For centuries, only about 500 have been used for food or medicine, and only about 220 are cultivated worldwide. Seaweeds are quite edible and rich in protein, considered similar to soybeans, says Ricardo, which of course soybean is used to make tofu. It's used to make some of those vegan meat substitutes. And of course, it makes lots of other delicious things as well, mostly in Asian cooking, but a lot of it is very delicious. Soy sauce, for example. Algae is high in fiber, low in calories, and rich with minerals, like 30% iron and calcium, as well as vitamins like B12. There we go. Like I just said, they mentioned that right there. Vegans and health food enthusiasts know spirulina as a type of blue-green algae that is chock full of key nutrients, including B-complex vitamins, beta-carotene, vitamin E, manganese, zinc, copper, iron, selenium, and gamma-linoleic acid, an essential fatty acid. Compare that with corn chips and white bread, two of the top most consumed foods in the United States. Compare spirulina with land vegetables. Most vegetable proteins are deficient in at least one of the amino acids. Wheat, corn, and rice are low in lysine. Soy is high in lysine but low in methionine. Vegetarians who don't research a scientific approach to diet can discover that mom's counsel to eat your vegetables can leave young children with rickets. I wouldn't say that's true. I would say broadly, if you're vegan or vegetarian, that you do want to eat a wide variety of vegetables, and especially different classes of vegetables, because they offer very different things. But you don't have to specifically every meal have like one of every type. As long as you rotate through them once a week or something, it's enough. Spirulina has more than 60% protein. So when people say to vegans, where do you get your protein? And if we had kelp, we would be getting it from them, which contains a lot of it. Now, algae and kelp are not commonly eaten in Western diets, but being where my wife is from, I've gotten an opportunity to actually try some kelp and stuff in food, and it is actually very good. It's a little bit of an unusual food. It kind of can be a little bit gooey, which is caused, I believe, most likely by long starches and stuff in it that kind of form a bit of a goo. Maybe a little like certain like greens or collard greens, I think they're called, have that sort of thing. But it is very healthy, and it's just something that you get used to. A lot of people eat it in the world, and if we're not used to eating something, sometimes a new thing can seem kind of gross, but you have to try different things and see if it's good. That being said, I don't think I want to try bugs. That's something that people want people to eat, but I don't know if I want to try that. But I am very excited to try if there is more actually commercially farmed kelp and more varieties. They were even saying that there's a form of kelp that tastes a lot like bacon, which sounds, I'm not a huge fan of bacon, but I really want to try it. They really made it sound surprisingly tasty in this book. And knowing that it is one of those things that it's not only not using up land and stuff and not using up fresh water, but it is actually improving the ocean and causing more life to grow. It's really a very positive thing, and so I will try to eat more kelp in the future. It's very good. If you guys want some specific things to use it in, you can usually buy like dried kelp in really authentic Chinese supermarkets and stuff. It's really good in like ramen. If you're having anything with seafood, it's probably pretty good at that too, as like a little extra thing, like if you're making like a fish soup or something. It's a good thing to experiment with. But I would say if you get the dry stuff, generally you need to like boil it to soften it. It's also kind of like tough meat. It's like very hard to bite. So I would like take some scissors and cut it into small pieces along, like tangent to the grain of the plant. Cut it into small pieces, and then it's totally fine. And it's kind of like got an interesting kind of bite to it and mouthfeel. It really adds some different texture to food, which I like, and produces some variety in what you're eating. So that was a very interesting one. I really like this Ricardo guy. I was trying to find more information about him online, but it's hard to find it. And there really is an economic incentive to do this, especially for the third world where average wages are very, very low. Some seaweed has essential materials that are used for makeup and that sort of thing, carrageenan and stuff. So these people can actually make a living doing this, and it's very easy. It requires very little equipment. I guess you need like a boat and some ropes and floats and stuff like that. And basically you take kelp and you tie it to the ropes and let it sit under the water, and it grows longer. Then you can pull it up, harvest it, and repeat the process. So it's very easy. They call it a sea trellis, actually. And this could be done at a very large scale as well. It's quite exciting, actually. I'm very excited to try more kelp and seaweed. I want to eat more. Sounds delicious. And they also talked about using it for animal feed, which is quite obvious. I mean, soybeans are, although they are delicious, they do use a lot of water and land, and they require a lot of artificial fertilizers in order to keep soybean production in the world going. Of course, traditionally, a lot of soybeans are consumed in Asia. Increasingly, they're making their way into the Western diet, not in whole food form, but because they are a low-cost commodity grain, they are used instead as a basis for various chemical ingredients to create highly refined foods, such as soy lecithin. That's a very common one. If you read ingredients on all your food, soy lecithin is a common one. It's an emulsifier. There is also sometimes soy protein used for various things, but I would really recommend trying to eat more of the whole food, and kelp is a better way to do that overall. But if we can just replace, soy lecithin with kelp lecithin and soy protein with kelp protein, that might have a big impact on the earth and allow us to have more land that is actually healthy on the earth, because most of us live on the earth still. We want the land to be in good shape. The bacon of the sea. In 2014, America discovered it is completely surrounded by an environmentally friendly ocean vegetable that tastes like bacon, has twice the nutritional content of kale, and 16% protein by dry weight. The fast-growing bacon of the sea grows along the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, and it is common in Ireland, Iceland, and the Atlantic side of Canada. Scientists with Oregon State University, in collaboration with Portland's Food Innovation Center, were searching for ways to prepare and market an ultra-healthy algae species called dulse that looks like translucent red lettuce. That is spelled D-U-L-S-E, if you want to search it up, which I will later as well. When they tried smoking it as if it were meat, they were astonished to find it tasted like a beloved breakfast staple. Journalist Barb Randall was invited to participate in a taste test with the Food Innovation Center and reported the result: absolutely delicious. Dulse can be grown anywhere in the world, meaning it can help end world hunger. That is very cool. And they're talking about, growing this in Mexico, Panama, Malawi, Tanzania, India. We as Canadians, I've noticed that we are very big fans of bacon. And bacon is obviously very, very bad for you. It is particularly bad for you because it is a highly, I think they call it a processed meat, the World Health Organization or something. And a few years ago, I think it was the World Health Organization, they announced that processed meats are as bad for you as smoking, and they have a certain amount of it. It's not a high amount that you have to eat for it to be as bad as having, a few smokes a day. And typically, highly processed meats, they contain a high amount of sodium. They are usually smoked or cured, which changes some of the compounds inside them to reorients them into more carcinogenic, exogenous chemicals that are not good for our body. So if we can have kelp that tastes like that, that would be a huge health improvement for a lot of people. It is considered a class 1 carcinogen now. I believe bacon is, because it's a highly processed meat. But yeah, that's a really cool thing, and I really hope it becomes more common. I don't think it will become more common. I think that if anything in the West here, we'll see more like kelp lecithin and kelp protein maybe, but I don't think we're going to see the whole food. But I can still have hope because it sounds delicious. Now, understandably, I may not have piqued your interest with kelp and algae, but I have something that is probably much more interesting to most out there, which is fish. Fishing is a very, very, I'm going to say it's probably a very, very destructive thing for the environment. If any of you out there are history buffs, you may have heard stories of what fishing was like prior to 100 years ago, where I believe in the North Sea, fishermen were saying that you could walk out onto the ocean. There were so many fish clogging up the water. On the east coast of Nova Scotia, fish hauls were unbelievable for many, many, many centuries as people just kept going out, and these things never seemed to deplete. The issue is, though, that the human population is many, 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 many times what it was back then. And I don't believe that's inherently a problem, but it means that we have to look at the wild world very differently versus our farmed world. That there are only a certain amount of fish out there in the world, wild fish, and if we just keep fishing them out, they are not quite going to disappear, but they're going to become completely uneconomical, and we won't have any more fish left. The catch for large fish, especially, has radically decreased since the 1950s, and the book has some numbers on that. I won't go through the effort of pulling them up, but larger fish like tuna that are popular for sushi and are very delicious fish, they have radically decreased in the last 50 years. Those type of large fish live very long, and they have to grow to be that large. And so as the human being, as the human existence, we keep fishing them out, and so they don't get large enough, and it's reducing their population. And so as a result, the fish prices are just going up a lot, and it probably has a lot of impacts on the environment to be fishing that much. I did watch a documentary, which is quite interesting, called Seaspiracy, that talked a bit about this. I won't go into that documentary too much. I might do a separate episode talking about that. And I actually met the director of that pretty famous documentary, which is very cool. He was a nice guy, and I saw him do a speech in Vancouver. But let's get right into it. There is this interesting gentleman here in the book, Neil Sims. He's probably also a doctor. I didn't read that part. But his solution is fish farming. Now, fish farming typically is also extremely destructive to the environment. It has a similar problem to agriculture in those watersheds, which is that the fish are pooping a lot, and that ends up causing weird microorganisms to grow there in these prime real estates, like close to the land, and so it ends up causing a lot of issues. But what he's doing it in Kona, Hawaii, and he also did it in La Paz, Mexico, interestingly, which we visited there and we like it very much. He is trying to create seasteading kind of captivity where you can farm fish, and because it's out in the ocean, it doesn't have those inherent negatives to it. And I think they're also farming like kelp to feed them as well, so it's kind of offsetting the carbon that way. But he's doing some very interesting stuff that could really change the economics of large fish and lead us to not have to catch them from the wild, but farm them. One of the things with large fish, like I said with tuna, they take a very long time to grow to the size that they are, or swordfish or any of those big ones. They have to eat many trophic steps, they call it, of fish. The actual energy in that tuna or swordfish is coming from algae or kelp, from small microorganisms. Those get eaten by little tiny fish, and those tiny fish get eaten by a bigger fish, and then that bigger fish gets eaten by an even larger fish. And so you can see that farming large fish or even catching them is very inefficient because a huge amount of the caloric energy is lost at every trophic step. I think they said it was 90%. So very little energy from the kelp is actually making it into the delicious fish that you want to eat. Interestingly as well, the oceans have, because they're kind of like the where we're washing away all of the stuff from the land. They have a lot of persistent organic chemicals. They have mercury. They have lead. That's why it's not recommended for pregnant women, to eat fish, especially large fish, is because they are quite high in those chemicals that are very negative for our health. When you increase the trophic steps of these fish, it also disproportionately increases the amount of those persistent chemicals because they tend to aggregate in fat and bones and all of this stuff. So it is an interesting problem that we have. But this gentleman, Neil Sims, is kind of rethinking how fish farming works. He says that there are 4 M's, which are the 4 fish that are currently farmed. There is milkfish, mullet, moi, and mahi-mahi. These type of large fish, they have to be fed fish meal, which is, an industrial product. You have to pull wild fish out of the ocean and grind them up to make this paste for these things to eat. So it's still just, offsetting farming offsetting wild catch, and it has its associated negative effects. But what he's saying is that he actually just took an open view and looked at what are some other fish that are maybe actually better for farming than these 4, which have their downsides and can't really work well with what he wants to do with seasteading. And he looked at this wild species called kampachi, which is a large predator fish, but it's generally considered not edible because it has parasites and it eats some algae that aggregates poisons in it that make it poisonous for humans. But if you culture it in a net that is a controlled farm, it won't have any of those parasites and it won't have any of those things, similar to farming in a different environment from where it's from. So it is a delicious fish. He says it's a very good option for making sushi or sashimi, which is a lot of the market for that sort of thing. Let's see. He says it here. He says, when I looked at this fish, it stood up in the tank and waved, culture me, culture me. Look at me. I'll spawn regularly. I'm relatively easy to rear in a hatchery. No cannibalism. Maintain a good feed conversion ratio, and we taste great. It's a sashimi grade fish. It says here as well that the method that Sims and his team have pioneered, these former pariah fish eat directly from pellets of fish meal made from anchovies. Neil Sims calls it a one-step trophic transfer. Algae are eaten by anchovies, which are in turn eaten by the kampachi. They have a body fat percentage of 4%. Oh, I'm sorry. The wild ones have 4%, but his have a fat content of 33%, high in heart-healthy omega-3s. They have no internal parasites, 0 chances of that algae poison, and no detectable mercury. That's very interesting as well. So yeah, by just rethinking this and finding a different species that actually had some benefits versus what was just farmed for the last several decades, and trying some new things, he's actually able to do a 1 or 2 step trophic transfer, and so that really reduces the amount of heavy metals, of contamination from PCBs, and reduces the actual caloric energy required to make this fish, which makes it a very good option. And I bet this type of stuff is actually very economically motivated. And so this isn't like goofy university science that has to be funded by the government. This is very likely the type of stuff that will actually just start to be done. Like, we'll just change how we're doing things as humans because it makes more sense to do it this way economically. But it's very, very cool. And they even talked in here about actually making fish food partially from plants, so making them vegetarians, they said. It's a little bit of a difficult process, and it's more expensive than fish meal currently. but it might come down in price as they figure it out a little bit better. But once again, similarly, kind of turning kelp, which is high in protein and stuff like that and nutrients, into a fish food. But I think they do have to add some fish meal in order to get them to eat it and to be healthy for them at the same time. So it talks about that here. It says the New York Times was reporting that it typically took 3 pounds of anchovies to produce 1 pound of Campacci. By 2010, typically 1.6 to 2 pounds of fish to produce a pound of Campacci. We were especially intrigued by Sim's bold claim that he was determined to bring this ratio down to 1 to 1. This is the golden ratio that even the most optimistic environmentalists declared unattainable, to actually produce high-quality fish protein with the same amount of low-quality fish protein. Sims put his reputation on the line by announcing this impossibility was feasible in the near future. By the time we got to Sims, he had already surpassed the ratio. This shocked us. Neil Villala's mariculture research project was increasing the amount of fish mass in the ocean. Campacci are net marine protein producers, he told us. If you put in a pound of Peruvian anchovies, you get more than a pound of Campacci out of the other end. Before, achieving that 1-to-1 ratio was the holy grail. Now we've done that, and we can do that at an industrial scale. We thought it was time to break out the champagne, but Sims didn't even break his stride before he once again declared the impossible. Now the goal for research is to create a fish diet that contains no fish meal or fish oil, and that would be pretty incredible, because at that point you would not need to be taking any more of these wild fish from the ocean. You could just leave them alone to have their own ecosystem, as would be nice on the land, rather than having to farm all these soybeans and oats, which I love. We can farm some of them, but we're taking up an enormous amount of land where they could just be more natural ecosystems. We could enjoy it for what it is rather than having to change it all to these monoculture type things. So if they could find a way to produce kelp and make it into seafood, that would be very awesome. And he's working on that, and I'm sure he's getting there actually. Fish farms being close to land and stuffing all of these fish into a little tiny area because the space around coasts is very limited and very very expensive and stuff like that. They stuff the fish into very tight areas, and so they typically have disease and parasites. I remember seeing what farmed salmon looks like, and it's not even pink. It looks very sick, and they have all these parasites attached to them, and it's very sad, the life that these farmed fish go through. He's saying that on his project, though, which is in the open ocean, in this kind of suspended net, and it's, as a result, open ocean has a lot of room. There's not really a lot of conserved space. They have a mortality rate of only 2% in the fish, whereas typically fish farms hover around 15%. And so not only is this an economical solution, it reduces the amount of fish that die, so therefore you can sell more fish, but it also is a much more humane way to treat these farmed fish if you really want to eat fish. Some of the stuff here in the book almost sounds too good to be true. There is Lisa Morgenthaler Jones and her husband Dave Jones, who founded Live Fuels, and they are working on making biofuels, which biofuels are one of those things that I hear about it and I just kind of zone out. One of those things, right? You hear that they want to grow canola oil and turn it into fuel, and it's like, this sounds so wasteful and so intense, so energy intensive, and this is going to cost so much money per gallon. It's never going to happen, and they're never going to get the economics right. And not only that, it'll have a lot of negative effects. But once again, they are doing some very interesting stuff, because they are just looking at, there's a lot of space in the ocean that we are not using for anything, and so that kind of changes the thinking a little bit. They're working on specifically what they want to do is make oil from fish, and so they want to take photosynthesizing small plants like pond scum or kelp or something, which are efficient at producing a lot of carbon, which is what we need, from the sun, and then find fish that are very efficient at turning carbon into oil. And so that's predominantly small single-step trophic fish. And he's saying that they want to find fish that are kind of like a cow of the sea. They just graze and they don't move around too much, and they produce oil. And so once you do that, you're actually taking carbon from the ocean, which is from the atmosphere, and then turning it into a fuel. So it is the carbon neutral in that sense, I suppose. But this almost sounds too good to be true. I think some really interesting stuff with that. And it's one of those things that maybe we will get to keep fossil-fueled machinery around for a little longer, because it certainly is helpful for some applications. I'm very skeptical, for example, that airplanes are going to become electrified and stuff like that. Even in a lot of situations, I think people's cars, they could get by with an electric car, especially if they live in a city. But there are many applications in which it would be still very helpful to have oil for things, even for production of plastics, because plastics are quite helpful for some niche uses and they're difficult to replace. In the next section of the book, they talk a little bit about a broad topic, but a very important one for seasteading, which is something called OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion. OTEC is a renewable energy that, unlike a lot of renewable energies, could form a base load for power generation, meaning that it is constant. It never goes off. It never turns on. It is a very reliable technology in that sense, but it exploits the temperature difference between the surface of the ocean and the extreme depths of the ocean. And I forget what the number is, but it has to be a certain depth. So in areas with a very shallow, long coastline, OTEC might not be very practical, but areas where there's a sharper drop-off in depth, it is probably extremely practical. But the technology works basically like this. It is very similar to the heat pump that I use on the tiny house, basically. It is more or less a very large air conditioning system. You heat up the working fluid using warm surface water that has been compressed. I guess you aggregate enough heat from the warm surface water to boil the working fluid, and then you cool it back down using the cold water from the bottom of the ocean. And that working fluid, like an ammonia most likely for a large application, will run a turbine electric generator. There's a variety of technical challenges to doing this. There are some OTEC plants that exist in the world. I think there's one. They're typically small installations used for experimentation, but I believe there's one running in Hawaii and maybe one in Japan. But there's a variety of issues with them. The system that I described is called an indirect OTEC as well. There are direct ones that just use water as the work fluid. Now, the big issue with that is that using seawater is full of a lot of stuff like krill and plankton and all this stuff. So you don't want getting in your turbine generator. So I would assume that in a direct OTEC application that they would need to remove all of that before using it as the working fluid and then send it back to the ocean. But with an indirect OTEC system as well, it is a typical inefficiency from energy conversion problem where by converting the temperature difference, you actually effectively get a lower temperature difference because there's an inefficiency in transferring heat all the time. But as well, to produce OTEC, you either produce it out at sea on a floating seastead and then run power cables up to the coastline where you want to use it. Underwater power cables are subject to corrosion and wave action, so that is pretty challenging. Or I suppose you would possibly also have to build extremely long, hopefully insulated pipes up to the surface to bring enough cold ocean water from the depths in order to run your thermal cycle. But it is a very interesting technology. I'm really curious to see what happens with this. It's one of those things that it almost sounds too good to be true. It obviously works, but it has maybe one of those things like nuclear power. I think in the 50s they were imagining that nuclear power would be able to provide all baseload power in the United States, but practically speaking, water-powered nuclear reactors ended up being the common type that ended up being used in almost every country. And they need a large water reservoir nearby, and they need a lot of environmental consideration for where you put them. They need a lot of water for their cooling, obviously. So you can't just put them in the middle of the Arizona desert. They don't have enough water to cool themselves off. So oak sounds like something like that. But that being said, just like nuclear power forms a very powerful niche in that type of situation, OTEC could form a very powerful niche on a lot of island nation seasteads because they are already in the middle of the ocean, and so they have ready access to deep ocean temperature differences that they can exploit. And for that, it sounds like a great option. It could end up providing a lot of economic opportunity for islands or seasteads if they have a readily available, cheap electricity source that can be used to power industrial processes that need electricity. So that is a very, very cool thing. Curious to see what happens. And it sounds like a very promising renewable energy, unlike a lot of other sources of renewable energy that get talked around, but require large battery storage in order to solve. That's going to be a killer for these renewable energy sources. I think they need to be able to reliably work, to be turned on and off, to provide base load if they actually want to replace petroleum. In my opinion, I could be wrong, but that's what I think it has to. That's how I think it has to be. Up till now, I've mainly been talking about the first half of the book that is talking a lot about technology and what's going to make seasteading possible and economical. The next part of the book is where we get more into the free market ideology, and I feel like I have to criticize this section a little bit. It's a very it's not to criticize this, but it is a pretty common libertarian argument that if we reduce laws and establish more freedom, that we will produce a large upswelling of economic activity and that sort of thing. And I do very much appreciate that, and I broadly think that's true. But some of the examples he's citing in here have a lot of other factors that are the case, and it's maybe a little bit oversimplified. Obviously, he can't take up the whole book with this sort of stuff. But similarly, like he's talking about, communist China versus Hong Kong, or some other examples sort of like that, maybe East Germany and West Germany, you could say, like the economic differences between them. But part of what happens in these situations is that, especially like I alluded to a little bit with Hong Kong before, they had some other kind of factors that were going in there a little bit, like the boat people and stuff, and the British. It's not just the laws, but also the people had an aptitude for being ready to take that on. If you just introduce a special economic zone in some area that's not really going to be apt for it, sometimes it won't do what you want it to do. He talks about the special economic zones in China, for example. And I think that a lot of the ones along the coastline are done well because, coastal people are often fishermen, kind of mobile and stuff like that, and they maybe have a bit more of an aptitude for that. China has introduced special economic zones or free trade zones in some other areas. Like I believe there's one on the border with Kazakhstan in the far west of China. That one is not doing much economically. And the reason why, obviously, is because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And maybe the people have an aptitude for it or not, but you can't just keep making special economic zones everywhere and have the same results that we saw in Hong Kong or Singapore or some of these other places. There's a little bit of a finesse there to it. I think though that broadly speaking, he is right, that if we make a bunch of seasteads in the world, the people from the third world that are very motivated and want to build things in their life, I think that they might come and build things and be motivated, which is great. But, I think that we should caution ourselves in thinking that some very poor countries, if we just made them very free, it's difficult to say whether they would actually become a Hong Kong or a Singapore. I think it would, in many cases, greatly improve the standard of living and allow for more efficient economy and that sort of thing. But temper our expectations that it will, that they'll form, new super economic trade zones. That's what I think as well. But I can broadly appreciate what he's saying here now that I think about it, and I do hope for a world that has more economic freedom for people and stuff. I think it has a lot of beneficial effects. Another particularly, I think, disingenuous example here that the book quotes is Mauritius. If any of you have ever looked at a map of economic freedoms or wealth or something, Mauritius is typically one of the countries that is quite high on the list of either. And notably, it is the highest in the continent of Africa, which is one of the biggest continents on the earth. It is an enormous landmass, which often on maps looks about as big as Europe, but because of turning a spherical shape into a flat shape, that is actually a very misleading way to show it. Africa is actually far larger than Europe. It is one of the world's largest continents. It's just because it's at the equator, it appears smaller on a flat map than it actually is. But Mauritius it really, really tops the continent of Africa in terms of economic development and freedom and all of these things. And I don't think the book necessarily says this, but I think a lot of people then jump to thinking that we just need to turn the rest of Africa into Mauritius, and then it will become just as successful and just as great as Mauritius. We need to copy that. One thing that when you look at Mauritius deeply is that you realize that in many ways it's not an African country. It has a lot of unique things that make it more like a Hong Kong or Singapore, especially a Singapore. Mauritius is an island that is pretty far from Africa. It is considered part of Africa geographically, but it is very, very far. It's a very far boat ride or flight to anywhere else in Africa. It is also, let's be honest. To me, an African country is made up of African people, right? Mauritius is, I don't know exactly what the largest demographic is in it, but it has a large French demographic, a large East Indian demographic, and it also has an African demographic as well. I think that they might be roughly thirds or something like that. They're all quite large, but I think as a result, African people might make up a minority of the country, even though they're a large minority. So it seems a little bit disingenuous, some of that, but as well, it actually reminds me in that sense a lot of Singapore, where it is. It's not. I wouldn't necessarily call it a highly diverse country, because, like, I would say Canada is a highly diverse country where there's you could probably come up with 10 large groups of people that live in Canada, but Mauritius and Singapore have 3 probably each. And to me, what kind of comes up with that is that they all probably form a bit of their own clade, but they all specialize into various things that their culture is good at, right? But yeah, when Mauritius has a really, really large gap between economic freedoms and economic productivity compared to the next best African country in that sense, which is usually South Africa on most graphs. So this is kind of the same thing. We're looking at some of these case study island nations that have some very unique factors, like a couple of groups that tend to specialize into very productive things. They tend to be banking countries, which not every country can be a banking country. Some have to make food, for example. Some have to produce steel. None of these countries produce steel or food, but we need steel or food. Some countries need to make those. So, it's a little bit of a head scratcher there. That some of these island nations have these unique features. We're kind of assuming that if we did this to all countries, that they would become just as wealthy. But I'm not sure of that. Although that being said, like I say, I think it would improve other countries to have freedom and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I can see both sides, but I'm not sure I agree. Let's end off here with looking at some interesting examples of people who are used to the mindset of living on a land nation controlled by a government with a military and police. Let's get used to thinking about some common questions that are not only applied to seasteads, but really are applied to any concept of a stateless society or a libertarian society. And he answers some of them right here, which are very interesting. Now, one of them is how will you have laws, or how will you be able to negotiate disputes within people? Which is the reality is that people, by and large, are law abiding, even when they're not being watched a lot of the time. But when that isn't the case, we could have things like excommunication or that sort of thing. So I suppose if you're thinking about a seastead as a bunch of little floating modules connected to each other, if somebody disagrees with the agreed upon laws, they are free to unhook their seastead and leave potentially, I suppose, which is a perfectly non-violent way of approaching that type of problem. We don't have to lock people in cells. We don't have to shoot people. We don't have to do any of that. He as well talks about won't countries invade seasteads? This is an interesting one. He takes some examples of places that, even though they have a lot of money, haven't been invaded. Like Hong Kong hasn't been invaded by China. Mauritius hasn't been invaded by India or something. There certainly are cases where invasions do take place, but I think that by and large, a lot of these cases he's taking, and I think that he's suggesting seasteads would be the same. They're like little islands that are economically wealthy. A lot of people in these large, established, sometimes corrupt countries, they actually move their money and their children to some of these island nations that are safer. And so the people in power don't want to invade them and destroy them. That's where they actually plan on escaping if their corrupt country goes to hell. So that's kind of an interesting thing that usually ends up happening. But as well, it is perfectly moral to have an agreed upon private enforcement if you need it. Especially in the modern world, there's very advanced weapons like surface-to-air missiles that could repel even aircraft attacks. If the people in the seastead felt that was necessary, why don't just fundraise, and put that into place if they're really concerned about it. But in other cases, it won't be a big concern. If you're really far in the middle of nowhere, nobody's ever going to invade you. It's that. Another thing they talk about here is piracy. Piracy is a thing that exists, and actual ships do have to deal with it. Freight ships and cruise ships, more so freight ships, have to deal with it. And so typically they do just have armed guards. Pirate ships do typically have weapons and stuff, so I suppose that's a way you could deal with it. But, perhaps another way to look at it, though, is that pirate ships, in the cases in the modern world that we're looking at, they typically come and attack a centralized control vessel like a cruise ship. A cruise ship has a captain, and if you take over the captain and his boathouse or whatever, you have taken control of the ship and you are now in possession of it. A seastead potentially doesn't actually have a centralized control system. It is more so a federation of little blocks that are attached together. So 10 pirates want to take over this federation. They're kind of going to have to go into everyone's house one at a time and threaten them to the point where, okay, you can control me now. I agree. I don't want to get shot. And that's a lot more difficult than taking care of a centralized, controlled organization like a cruise ship. It's a similar thing for nations invading a situation like this. When a nation has invaded another country and taken control of it, in every case, what they do in nearly every case is that they go and take out the military and central generals and stuff like that, and political leaders. They take out a couple of them, and then they get the other top guys to promise to obey them. I mean, that's what the United States, when it finally, Second World War, and took over Italy and Japan, they didn't just wipe everything off the map and start fresh. They just took out the top leaders and got the rest of the guys to agree to follow the United States' wishes to rebuild those countries. And what I'm saying essentially is that these countries already have a centralized control system, and the big advantage of taking it over is to take over that centralized control system. In some sort of federated seastead, this is not possible. Once again, the government could try to invade it. They could try to send their military there. Maybe if they have a really, really big military, maybe they would have a better chance. But once again, they kind of have to go to everyone's house, knock on the door, and say, do you agree to be part? Let's say Canada invaded a seastead somewhere. The Canadian military has to knock on every door and say, okay, do you agree to be Canadian? Here's a paper to sign that you agree to be Canadian. And, if there's 10,000 people living there, they have to go to every single door and do that. And maybe some of these people have weapons, depending on the seastead's laws. So then the government has to contend with that. They have to go to every seastead and do that. And so that's a lot more difficult than invading an island that has a centralized government, let's say. So it seems a little bit fanciful. We're not used to thinking that way because we do live in centralized government-controlled societies, but some sort of federated seastead, that seems a lot less practical. And the less practical it is, the less likely somebody's going to want to invade it, because they're going to have to spend a lot more money to get less out, frankly. And let's say you take it over. What's to say that some of the seasteads don't unlink from the central seastead and just run away in the night? It's like, okay, we came here to capture a 100-unit seastead, and 50 of them are gone the next day, and we don't know where they are, right? So it's that type of thing. On land, more practical, but in some sort of federated, free society, less practical. All right, so that's pretty much going to be it for my podcast about the book here. Would I recommend the book? I don't think you necessarily, if you find it interesting, you don't necessarily need to read the whole book. I think just the first couple chapters will give you the headlines about the really interesting stuff, and then if you find it super interesting, you can read the rest. There's a couple things in there that I skipped because they're kind of not that interested in this, like the health area. I'm pretty young and don't have any health issues, so having offshore health things doesn't really seem that interesting to me, but it might really interest some people. And overall, it's a well-written book and entertaining to read and stuff. So I think that'll be it for this episode. I have been Liam, your host. Thank you so much for listening to the Kerry and Liam podcast. I certainly hope we see you guys in the next one. Thank you. Bye.